Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network that learns, teaches, organizes, advocates, and innovates for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. This episode continues our conversation with Rosemary Blanchard, Professor Emeritus at California State University, Sacramento, and a founding member of HRE USA. Rosemary discusses how human rights education is an integral component of civic education in the United States, along with insights about how human rights education can be advanced in this country, particularly in K-12 public education. One of the things you've done, though, is you've worked on position statements in NCSS. What do you see as the impact of those position statements?
Well, first off, they provide a foundation for people to look at their own thinking and to look at their own practice. And also, they provide a legitimacy. The thing about the National Council for the Social Studies is it is not an advocacy organization for one point of view. Mm-hmm. It is a professional society of educators. It is the key society that deals, an association that deals in a professional way with what constitutes social studies. What are the key elements in social studies as it's taught and experienced in the United States? And so when they make a statement, it's not a partisan statement that, well, you're on that side and I'm on this side. It's a statement about what is professionally necessary for social studies education to be competent. And frankly, that's the only way in which these concepts of human rights and humanitarian law, even though our nation has committed to them by treaties, that they become something that becomes food for our own children, something they encounter.
So thinking about that position statement was adopted about 9 years ago, recently revised and readopted. Mm-hmm. And now you're working on the Coalition for Civics Education. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the connection between the newer initiative in the civics education and what you've done in NCSS?
Well, one thing personally, I hope I've gained a little credibility with the civics folks by working within the system of NCSS and not challenging the importance of civics, just insisting that for a democratic civics, the small d democratic civics, it has to be grounded in respect for every human being, or else factionalism takes over and winning becomes more important than maintaining social cohesion. And so that became very important to me. And now as civics and history sort of shrank out of the educational environment, the very space where human rights and humanitarian law might be brought into the education experiences of children got shrunk down to where many civics educators said, well, it's fine, Rosemary, but there's no room for it. We're lucky if we get to bring up the Constitution. Excuse me. And so I could see that there needed to be a space for civics education if there was going to be a space for human rights education. But it's very important that that space for civics education not proceed without being interconnected with human rights education. Because civics by itself, if you look at it in all societies in the world, civics teaching how to relate effectively to the society one is in and the government one has, there's a civics that goes with monarchy. Thomas Hobbes, as a matter of fact, thought that Aristotle should not be taught to young people or they might question monarchy. So civics by itself, if it isn't grounded in that respect for every human being, is ultimately going to veer away from being democratic and inclusive.
So let me take that one step further, because one of the common issues that I think you've encountered, as well as I have encountered, has been the unfortunate belief, in my view, that human rights problems only exist somewhere else outside of the United States. And we've had to struggle, as you know, to try to embed the idea that human rights are a central focus of history and social studies in this country. How do you feel you should approach that issue, that it's not just over there, it's here too?
Well, constant repetition, I think. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm getting a cough. But I've had a different answer until I encountered Carol Anderson's book, because I just thought I attributed a lot of that to the way in which the rise of Joe McCarthy and the kind of nativism that went along with him shut down the discourse of human rights in the United States in the 1950s, just when it should have found its way into all of our social studies texts. But then I came to realize that it was actually more serious than that. There was no oversight involved. It was a recognition at some powerful political levels that a focus on human rights was going to open a can of worms about the whole origins and path of inequality in our society. So what people say is not always what they're feeling in their guts. The things they say about why human rights is something that we have to look at in other countries where there's a much worse problem, and besides, we have our Constitution here, is often a verbal cover for fear. And that fear is that if we really look at everything from a human rights perspective, I'm going to lose something that I need to keep. I will lose. And it's very important. I mean, on some parts that's true. When you have an inequitable system, if it becomes equitable, then those who've had too much are going to have to cede some to those who've had too little. But at the same time, a human rights focus doesn't take away the human value of anybody. And that, to me, is a really important part of human rights analysis. It's one reason why I like to do it with young children. I like to discuss human rights with young children, because they are not yet already blinded to ideas that certain phrases automatically mean something bad. And when you approach them with the fact that their value, their little human dignity, and do little kids know that their human dignity has been sat on, that their little dignity is better protected if everybody has it. That if you just are respected when you're more powerful than the bully, then what do you do when the bully then gets more powerful than you again? And if you put down that bully in a cruel way, then if he gets more buddies, he can do that to you. So what's another way to get, I call this the human rights of the playground. What's a better way to get us all enjoying the playground? There's certain ways you can't treat anybody, even somebody who's treated you badly. And the solution isn't to push them away, but to bring together our respect for one another.
So let's take that idea and let's look at some current problems that are really on the front burner in this country. Efforts to limit academic freedom, censorship of libraries, voting rights restrictions, violence directed against minorities, and also against migrants in the LGBTQ community. So with the platform you're talking about, how would you deploy HRE to try to address any one of those?
Well, huge question there, Bill. For one thing, you do it very situationally. You've got to get intimate in dialogue with people for much of that. But in addition, I really think the discourse of human rights needs to keep finding its way into laws that are domestic laws, not laws about how we're going to evaluate other countries. But the phrase human rights is very important in laws and regulations. I think some of the work that I've done with the Educating for American Democracy group and the Civics Now coalitions is trying to integrate the language of those two paths, the civics language and the human rights language, so that in a democracy you encounter them both. When you're talking about civics for a democratic society, human rights will be in the discussion there. And that this happened from our, not only in our discourse with our adults, but in our teaching of our young people. And I think we have to raise human rights analyses when we're standing up to, I mean, part of it is just there's a certain raw power when you are a governor and you have a majority of your state legislature behind you, you can do things that are maybe pretty undemocratic. And only the courts may, not will, but may stop you. So that's where you're in a direct confrontation. And you have to stand tall, stand short. That's what I do. But you can't, I think it's important not to slip over into being so mad at the people who do this that you start demonizing them as human beings. It's okay to demonize what they're doing, but when there's such a temptation to step out of our human rights focus and despise the humanity of somebody else.
So I'm getting the impression that one of the important sources you're drawing on also is the Council of Europe, because they've made a concerted effort to try to integrate democratic education with human rights. Would that be fair?
That would be absolutely fair. In fact, I can thank you for introducing me to the charter. When you mentioned it to me, I had to go and get a copy almost immediately. As soon as I first found one online and then got a paper copy and started looking at the educational materials that have been developed within the Council of Europe, especially because they have educational materials integrating citizenship education, as they call it, and human rights education, even in the primary grades and all the way up. Right. They buy into my understanding that you start young with this.
Now, of course, the Council of Europe is not a national ministry of education, but they do have the imprimatur of the European Union, and they have a broad, you might say, mandate to deal with all the countries in the European Union. So even their progress is mixed, I think. But at the same time, they have actually put documents together, as you know, that actually makes that connection. Now, one of the other things I wanted to talk to you about was this recent book chapter you wrote with Sandy Sokot. Can you talk about that, please?
Yes, indeed. That was in a book called Mindful Social Studies, edited by Natalie Kiefer and Tori Flint. And our chapter, I always have to look it up because I always forget what we called it. Our chapter was the Human Rights Portal to Teaching Mindfulness and Civic Engagement. And really, the star of that chapter is Sandy Sokot, who has developed and runs the program, The World as It Could Be. Because Sandy is doing exactly what I, on a policy level, was thinking about, but Sandy does it hands-on. She was working initially with high school students, not just in their schools, but in their social groups in a county county center for young people.
In California, right?
In California, yeah. And now she's actually doing some things with the second grade class, which is great. And what she has done is she has taken the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and introduced it to students, young people, children, in terms of a guide to both the value that they have, the rights that they have, but the rights grounded in value, not in power. And the fact that those rights are shared with everyone, that the rights are not a zero-sum situation where if I have this right, then you have less. And so she's able to guide them through arts and very creative work toward looking at their issues that are concerned to them. And first off, building up that sense of own personal worth and value. And that's the first part of it. And that was the mindfulness of our own value. And that being so rock solid that an external force cannot unvalue or devalue me. They may devalue me in their mind, but my value remains intact. This is sort of a very Stoic philosophy. Epictetus would approve. But it's from that point of feeling grounded in their own worth, they then look at issues going on around them and seek to understand them without hating, understand them in a way that doesn't say, oh, well, I guess it's what I have to put up with, or, oh, that horrible person is so bad. But say, okay, this way of doing things is hurting me, and that way of doing things is hurting this other person. So what do I have to offer out of my experience that can improve this situation for others and for me, so that the well-being of others does not come at the expense of the sense of value of the child? And that, I think, is the thing that's so important. No, I don't have to give up my own worth, especially since many of the children she works with have been devalued by their education and by their community. And so until they have that sense of value, they're not in a position to holistically affect the larger community in a way that is human rights driven.
And this would, of course, tie in very well with the idea of creating a human rights culture in any institution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A human rights culture is probably, I had underestimated its importance until I came to realize that it's really everything. Because if you are beating somebody over the head with they must respect human rights and making them feel put upon and degraded in the way in which you're proceeding, you're not going to have a convert. You might even have somebody who shuts up while you have more power. But like I would discuss with the little kids in the playground, when they have more power, they'll come back with a vengeance. So that human rights culture where the respect is mutual and where what happens to one genuinely affects the well-being of all, then that kind of a culture is an environment in which the next generation, the young people, can become strong in their values for themselves and for others, and not feel that they have to take a back seat to some other part of the culture.
Well, that's a tremendously challenging goal, but certainly one that can be met, I think. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take perseverance. But you and Sandy are the type of people, I think, who can make it happen. So let me turn to our last question here. Now, these questions, of course, are asking you for answers that are a bit challenging, but I think you can handle it. So here we go. Who would be the most influential role model for your work in human rights education, either living today or deceased?
You know, I have played with this question ever since you sent it to me, and I put a different name and face there every time. And I probably, as soon as I say one, I will end up thinking, oh no, I shouldn't have said that one. The two that come most strongly to me are probably Nelson Mandela and Thích, because Thích Nathan's concept of interbeing, to me, is so foundational to a universal respect for human rights, because it isn't just something that's being offered to others, or given out of largesse. It is essentially my hand acting when my leg is bleeding, because it's my body that's injured. And that's the whole concept of interbeing. I inter-am with every other person and with all of nature.
Well, Rosemary, that's very interesting. Tell us a little bit more about the origins of Thich Nhat Hanh. Where is he from?
Thich Nhat Hanh was from Vietnam. He was a Buddhist. During the Vietnam War, he was ultimately vilified by both the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong and the Americans. And when he came to the United States, he was actually nominated by Martin Luther King Jr. for the Nobel Prize because of his deep understanding of peace and because of his non-hating in this terrible situation. And he, for many years, had a monastery in France, not because he chose not to go back to Vietnam, but because Vietnam chose not to let him come back. And he worked with, he helped to rescue many boat people and helped to get them resettled. He held retreats for Vietnam veterans, American Vietnam veterans, who were going through horrible conditions of their PTSD and could not escape the trap of the violence they had been part of. And I've always thought it was an extraordinary thing that a Vietnamese Buddhist monk became one of the most powerful sources of healing for American veterans by helping them encounter indeed the pain of what they had done, but to realize, as he would tell them, you were the tip of the candle. You are the candle that burned, tip of the candle that burned bright. But the whole rest of the candle is part of how you got to where you are. And so we can see the pain because of you, but the pain was there and the wrong was there. And you were, in a sense, one of its first victims. So his non-hating in a situation in which he had every right to hate, kind of, I don't know, it compelled me on both a political and spiritual level. I mean, it's sort of what maybe that's why I also so admired Nelson Mandela, because it is so easy, comfortable even, to hate back when you have been really, really badly treated. And it's natural. Some of that is what you almost must do to draw yourself out of a terrible situation. And yet, if we go forward from the hate, then we just keep recycling. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? We switch it all around over and over again. And the cycle of hatred and retribution and repentance and hatred and retribution and repentance never stops. And clearly, only in healing our own hate, without in any way diminishing the reality of what was done to us, is a path forward. How do we live with each other in this world? I had a colleague who was invited, of all places, to Rwanda. He was a Quaker, and he was involved in the Alternatives for Violence program. And he was invited to Rwanda to work with villages where there were people, there were Tutsi and there were Hutu people who had destroyed each other's families, but economically and culturally didn't have any other place to go. I mean, in a sense, it's like the World Village. They were in a village. Their land is there. We've done these unspeakable things to each other. And yet, where else can we be but here? What are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Do we kill each other till everybody's gone because we can't get over what was done to us? And he told me, I said I'd go because I didn't see how I could refuse. But I'm learning from people that have the courage to even try this, to even attempt to get back to wholeness after such terrible things.
Well,
and so
certainly that's going to be one of the great challenges after Ukraine and Russia conflict ends.
If we can't get past it, it will end in ways we don't want. And you know what I mean. Yeah, no, the to not feel like you have to, and this is what was this is where American exceptionalism makes us particularly poor at dealing with this. We keep wanting Black people to get over enslavement. We keep wanting indigenous people to get over the occupation and destruction of their cultures. That doesn't work. And the true healing is not getting over something, but coming through it. Perpetrator and victim coming through it, looking at each other honestly, but with eyes of compassion, to where when I truly see what you have done to me, I don't have to come back and destroy you because I now hate you so much.
Right.
And when I truly see what I have done to you, I don't become so appalled that I become catatonic and despair.
Right.
Because we've all got to be functional in this world.
Right.
And we've got to functionally look at eons of pain that we have inflicted on each other. A Tlingit classmate of mine once said, when she was trying to understand what Europeans had done to indigenous peoples in North America, she started reading European history. And somewhere around Vlad the Impaler, who is the origin of Dracula, she said she began to realize that Europeans have done so many horrible things to each other that all of that pain came with them to the Americas. And no wonder you guys have made such a mess of things.
Well, that also was the same, that was the same realization many of people who were colonized had after the end of World War I, when the concept of racial domination was totally exploded when they came to Europe and they saw exactly what was going on, that there was no superiority. They were killing each other, slaughtering one another. So there was no superiority of European civilization, and they saw it face to face. But I want to go over to the next question, which is, what quote most effectively sums up your view about the importance of human rights?
I've been looking for that quote ever since you sent me this. I don't know if I have one.
It's okay.
I'm seriously, I have read and discarded so many. The closest I can come to is the title of one of Thich Nhat Hanh's poems, Call Me by My True Names, which is a poem in which he relates himself not only to the victims, the boat people. He wrote the poem after he had read about a little girl who had been raped by sea pirates one of the boat people, little girls, and had jumped into the ocean and drowned in her despair. And he realized he had to see himself he said, it's easy to see yourself as the little girl, but I had to see myself as the little girl and the sea pirate. Because I had to realize, if I had grown up in the villages on the border of Thailand and the ocean that they grew up in, I might have been a sea pirate.
Mm-hmm.
And I might have been the one doing this. And if I don't accept that in me, then I can't possibly bring healing to the world in ways that are healing for the little girl who went into the ocean and for the villages from which the sea pirates come. And if we don't heal both, then we don't really heal anything. So I think, call me by my true names, and my true names will include everyone. I used to tell a friend of mine once, the trouble is you really would like to be a different species from Adolf Hitler, and we're not.
Well, it's an interesting quote, because when you look at what happened during the Holocaust, of the people who actually saved others, people who were altruistic, research shows that they embraced the idea of a universal ethos more than other people did.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that concept that we have an expanding zone of responsibility for other people ties in nicely to what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
So the last thing is, if you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights in the United States, what would that be?
Well, the power broker in me would like to see education in human rights required in the standards for every grade level. But that wouldn't be enough, because unless that arose indigenously out of the various states where it needs to happen, then it would be one of these allegedly foreign ideas that somebody's trying to make us learn, and I don't like it. I would use not only the phrase human rights, as my aunt did when she was reading that little book to me, but also the language and concepts and relationships that young children are most connected with. In other words, in a very age and grade appropriate way. And I would create environments where they could explore their value and the value of others. I wouldn't just have lessons at them, like learning about Betsy Ross and the flag, but opportunities to experience sharing with kids that they may have difficulty with. Mm-hmm. And have this be part of the core of how we introduce them to the world they're in. My daughter's a primary grade teacher, and she has taught me it is teaching children to be people. There are basic people skills, and human rights needs to be part of that learning to be people. That my value and the value of another person are interconnected. They inter-are, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say. And to the extent that that became part of the way that young children see the world, and that they are reinforced in seeing the world that way, and that they associate it with the term human rights, in that way, they would, I think we would not have such a hard time introducing the more complex concepts of human rights later on. I had the gift of getting some training at the very end of his life by a economist who had developed a social studies curriculum for the elementary grades. His name was Lawrence Senesh, and he put together our working world curriculum. In fact, I was the first author on the last paper he ever published. And Larry's whole thing, if you will, was that for students to understand the concepts of the social sciences in college, when they approached them in college, they needed to be introduced to the fundamental concepts of each of those social sciences from their earliest educational experience. It's hard for me to even say it without putting on a Hungarian accent, the fundamental concepts that Larry would talk to me about at length. And human rights, I think, is the same way. He was right. That because then when you encounter a concept in a more complex environment and in a more academic way, it resonates with something you already feel and know. And so he not only developed this curriculum, but he had demonstrated it by working with elementary students in various places. One had been a BIA school in the Navajo Nation, Sanasti School, where he had worked with students there in terms of economics and introducing them, hearing from them and introducing them to concepts from their family situations that carried fundamental, that were aligned with the fundamental theories of economics. And he was able to demonstrate when these young people came with him for a presentation he made up in Colorado, that they did get the fundamental concepts. That it's not true that you have to wait until they're old enough to teach them these concepts. Larry said by the time they're old enough, they're too old. You need to teach them before then. So I guess thinking back on Larry, he was right. It'll take a while. But if the fundamental concepts of human rights and respect for human dignity of all was a part of every child's education from the earliest levels in preschool, the earliest primary grades, I think we would see a difference in culture. And that would make it possible for us then to use human rights more effectively in education and in the building of our own society.
Well, that makes an awful lot of sense. And it's an interesting parallel you're bringing up, because Larry Senesh was a major figure in social studies in the 60s and 70s, and that whole concept of developing a framework for the social sciences was very powerful at that time. It's been a pleasure talking with you today, Rosemary, and I hope we can do this again. Thank you.
I hope we can too. Thanks so much, Bill. It's nice to have an opportunity to share my sort of tattered world experience.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, and Deezer. They will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Rodelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota.